Hi, folks. My name is Stephanie, and I work with Climbing the Seven Summits. I just want to go ahead and introduce Mark and Lisa, who are here with us today. Mark and Lisa are going to be our hosts today. We've also put our agenda up. We have a whole slew of information. I'll let you read over that as Mark and Lisa are introducing themselves. Mark is joining us from Invoke Endurance today. Mark is a second-generation mountain climber who has been climbing since he was a very young guy. So I want Mark to tell us a little bit about his professional experience. He also guides for CTSS, which is really incredible, and is a fitness coach as well. So Mark, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit how you kind of made that leap from being a young boy climbing with your family to being a professional mountain guide and a professional fitness coach. Mark.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, it's great to be here. Indeed, I grew up as a climber and started working as an expedition guide when I was in my 20s. So now I have getting on for 30 years of experience in the guiding industry. Over the last decade, I've slowly transitioned out of guiding and more into coaching. And I was lucky enough to live in Bend, Oregon at a time when our Vogue founder, Scott Johnson, lived in Oregon. And, that helped me kind of down the path of coaching for mountaineering. I think that one of the strong suits that I bring to the coaching realm is just my field experience on a lot of these peaks and goals that people have, especially some of these more popular peaks I've been lucky enough to guide a number of times over my career. And so I try and approach the coaching not only from obviously sort of a fitness preparation perspective, but also just trying to help people be ready in all those, small and not so small ways logistically and what to expect in these peaks and set them up for success there. So yeah, great to be here.
Awesome. Mark, it is so great to have your firsthand experience guiding and now as a fitness coach. It really puts it into the realm of realness for you and for everyone you work with. Speaking of climbing peaks, Lisa, you are an incredible mountaineer as well. You've finished all 7 summits, which we love here at Climbing the Seven Summits. And then oftentimes you've also been the only woman on these expeditions. So we really wanted to bring you on to also have a voice for different groups of people who are climbing. So you started Alpine Athletics. So I would love to know how these experiences, finishing the 7 summits and also being a woman out there climbing, led you to start Alpine Athletics and a little bit more about your background. I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Stephanie. So as we noted earlier, I'm from Illinois, so I didn't really grow up in the mountains or even considering mountaineering or even knew what that was. And then I moved to Seattle, which is where I live today, and started climbing shortly thereafter. And this was in the mid-2000s, so I was almost always the only woman on my climbing team or my expedition team. And that really led me to be as prepared as I could possibly be because I never wanted to be considered or seen as the weakest link on that team. And that really sparked this interest in understanding training and physiology and just preparation in general. And then in 2018, when I was actually at K2 Base Camp, I came up with the idea of Alpine Athletics, wrote all the content for a website, and started that company soon after I summited that peak. And we focus on, very holistic approach to preparation. So making sure that athletes are prepared, not just physically, but also mentally and tactically. I'm still climbing, but it's very fun for me now to help other people achieve their goals in the mountains. And then more recently, I've become very interested in organizing all women's expeditions. And we did one of those together with CTSS last year, or the beginning of this year. And I like those expeditions for many reasons, but one of them is that they always have some sort of philanthropic intention as well. So it feels really good to help other women get comfortable and build their skills in the mountains and then give back to the communities that we're climbing in.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me today.
Lisa, thank you so much for sharing all that. Folks, I know there was a lot of questions about, hey, I'm a lady. Hey, I'm this old. Hey, I've kind of had these health concerns. And so both Mark and Lisa today are going to do a great job of helping you understand how to really set yourself up for success if you're worried about, hey, I might be the only girl. Hey, I'm 63 years old. Is this going to impact me? How can I train and be prepared for that? And then the other thing I want to mention, one thing that we just so much appreciate about Evoke Endurance and Alpine Athletics, and Lisa mentioned it, is that they really do focus on the holistic training. You'll see mental preparation is in there, and that is extremely important to climbing the 7 summits. At the end, we'll share our philosophy and our kind of why we do what we do and our climbing style. And being humble, having humility on the mountains, and understanding that and being mentally ready is a huge piece of what we do at CTSS. So I just want to give my thank you to both of you for being here today, for being wonderful fitness coaches and working with or having wonderful fitness companies. We're going to start everyone off on the same playing field. We are going to do some fast facts today. We think this is really important here just to kind of level it out and make sure that everyone has some baseline information before we dive into the meat of it. Mark, I'd like you to review some of these fast facts and just get the conversation started for us. I'll turn it over.
Awesome, thank you. We'll just go over a few things here to kind of set the stage, and we'll dive into most of these deeper as we go along. So endurance is a term that we throw around a lot in the climbing community because that is the primary driver of what enables us to do these long days in the mountains. And I think one nice way to frame it is to think about it versus strength. And this, in my mind, it's not a black and white, it's a continuum from one to the other. And, very simply, I like to think of endurance as doing something for a long duration that has a relatively light load. And then, of course, strength is, doing something for a relatively very short duration that has a very high load. And although endurance is the thing that informs our ability to move in the mountains the most, because it's a continuum, kind of raising the bar all along that continuum, including all the way into the pure strength realm, really has some downstream positive effects for folks that we find. That being said, mountaineering is primarily an endurance activity. As such, it is a really hard activity to raise your fitness level for in a very short period of time. I'm sure Lisa will echo my sentiment here. The best possible thing for athletes that we get that have big goals is to also have big runways to work with those folks, because I think we as human beings in general and as athletes tend to somewhat overestimate what we can get done in a short time frame. But we also tend to somewhat underestimate what we can get done in a long time frame. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5 years to work with an athlete, it's amazing the transformations that you can see when they put in the work over that time, but that time is critical. And that also just allows a nice ramp rate so that folks can stay healthy and uninjured along that path. Many of the things that we do are multi-day endeavors or multi-month endeavors. And I think that's an important point, that sometimes the peak fitness and just kind of being on that razor's edge of fitness, as I like to think of it, is less important than being quite fit, but also very durable, because these aren't singleton day events like running a marathon for the most part, or other athletic events you can put a date on the calendar. So you need to have that durability over a time frame on the trip, and the training needs to reflect that. The long runway of training we kind of touched on, not be able to cram for it. It's crucial to bring your level up slowly and healthily. It is ultimately a skill sport in almost all realms of mountaineering. And this is maybe a little bit of a pet peeve of mine coming from the guiding background, but I do find that some of the easier or slightly less technical mountaineering objectives get a little bit overlooked as to not having a skill component to them. As we'll probably touch on a little bit later with altitude, you already have a big limiter in your ability to move around with the thin air. And so you can't put additional limiters and expect to be wildly successful. So making sure that your movement skills and your technical skills are up to par for whatever the objective is, in my mind, it is paramount and a greatly overlooked aspect of training in some folks. Altitude is kind of part and parcel to a lot of these objectives that we train for. So, having a really well-developed aerobic capacity, but also just understanding how your body works and how it responds to altitude, I think, is a really important consideration. And then we'll dig into the nitty-gritty of this a little bit, but the way that we train for these objectives and just the physiological responses that your body produces and the way it adapts is fairly well understood. There's a reason that these applications and sort of these training interventions are the way they are. And I would encourage everyone who's interested to try and dig into those a little bit. And without getting too far in the weeds, we'll try and unpack some of those today. Lisa, do you have any thoughts about some of those fast facts?
I would absolutely underscore that this isn't a test you can cram for, and starting to prepare early is really key. And then along with that, the other thing that I see athletes sometimes struggle with is consistency. And I think that is really key when it comes to seeing changes and letting your body adapt and seeing your fitness increase over time. And it's hard to do. We all have busy lives, and fitting training into that already packed schedule can be a challenge. But to the extent that you can be consistent with your training, you will see more changes more quickly.
I was just going to add, we were just talking about this slide ahead of time, and we were also mentioning that we could do a whole 10-part webinar on just this slide right here. So Mark's going to continue to talk and hopefully make the information nice for us.
I thought that maybe one of the best ways to kick off this discussion of actual training applications is to just have a common understanding of what we're talking about. And this is a somewhat complex slide, but it might be useful for folks to refer back to. I think one of the most important things to understand with heart rate zone training is not everyone speaks the same language, which is a little bit unfortunate. And I'm sure that Lisa's encountered this in her coaching as well. But there are different training zone systems. Not everyone uses a 5-zone system. And even within that, not everyone defines the zones exactly the same. So I think, if you're communicating to another athlete, if you're communicating with a coach, I think one of the most basic things is to make sure that you're speaking the same language. And when you say, zone 1 or zone 2, it's what they also think of as zone 1 or zone 2. So this is a quick reference here to the kind of what I think of as the 5-zone system. And honestly, even Lisa and I might differ on this a little bit, but it's a good basis for the discussion. There's 5 zones, and as endurance athletes, we're primarily concerned with zone 1 and zone 2 for the sort of the bread and butter of our training, and we'll unpack that here in a future slide. And in particular, we're concerned with the border between zone 2 and zone 3. And that's what we refer to as your aerobic threshold. And then a little less, but still interested in what the border between zone 3 and zone 4 is, which would be your anaerobic threshold. So this slide also has some heart rate tips in there, and that your zone 1 would be 10 to 20% below your aerobic threshold, and also a scale of perceived exertion if you look under RPE. And I more and more also like to include the discussion of RPE in some of my training intensities with athletes. I think it's good for a couple of reasons to be able to communicate how hard something feels in perceived exertion. And for those that aren't familiar with RPE, it's a sort of just a relative exertion between 1 to 10. It's a 1 to 10 scale. The primary zone 2 training is loosely 2 to 4 in a 1 to 10 system for most folks. And I generally think of it as 3 to 4. And then we have a ventilation here where, you should be able to sort of speak easily or in short sentences or in bursts, what the muscle fiber type that's being called upon here, the training effect, which I think is important. What are we actually after when we train in these various zones? How we might go about that. And then the duration of training that's common in each of these zones. And, these are ranges, these are guidelines, these aren't quite hard and fast, but it'll give you a really good idea when we refer, later in the talk to, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, where we're landing in here, and might be a good reference for people in the future. Lisa, do you use this same basic 5-zone system and understanding?
Yes, generally I'll use 5 zones, sometimes 3. I find that sometimes that can make things even simpler for athletes. But I think what's important is what's going on physiologically, regardless of how many zones you ascribe to. The key is what's happening physiologically and what those milestones are across that continuum of your heart rates.
I sort of refer to the 5-zone system because it's somewhat standard, but for me, I do a lot of discussion about zone 1, zone 2, and then all the other zones.
Right. That's what we care about as endurance athletes.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit in the low intensity and high intensity training components on the future slide here.
Mark and Lisa, I have 2 questions. Everyone's zones, like my zones and your zones, would be different. Is that correct?
Yes. So they're They're different, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. There's no good or bad range of heart rate zones or thresholds. It's all very personalized, and knowing them is what allows you to train in an even smarter way.
Awesome. Does your aerobic threshold change as you maybe mature, as you train, as something happens?
So the short answer is yes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So like Mark said, we all have this spectrum of heart rates, and they go from on the low end, your resting heart rate, to on the high end, your max heart rate. And just to sort of ground everyone along that spectrum, like you saw on the last slide in that chart Mark showed, there are different metabolic and physiologic changes that happen as your heart rate increases. And the one that we really care the most about as endurance athletes is your aerobic threshold. To reiterate what Mark said, this gets a little bit confusing sometimes because we're not always talking about the same thing. And there are multiple names for the same threshold. So I'll come back to that in a second. But if you're a little confused, you're not alone. To explain what your aerobic threshold is, let's start with this concept of energy. So our bodies need energy to survive, of course. And that energy is available to us in two forms, either fat or carbohydrates. And our bodies are these amazing machines, and we have the ability to use either or both of them as fuel, depending on the situation. So as you're sitting here, or maybe some of you are exercising while you're listening to this, so bonus points for you. But as I'm sitting here comfortably, my heart rate is 72, which is at the low end of my heart rate spectrum. And so my body's demand for energy right now is low. It's not zero, but it's pretty low. And so my body then chooses to use fat as a fuel source. And we all, regardless of how lean we are, have enough fat stores to survive for several weeks. I listened to a podcast recently which suggested that even lean individuals have enough fat to power 30 plus days of continuous exercise. So we all have enough fuel in the form of fat. And there's this metabolic process that turns fat into the fuel that our body can actually use. And that process requires oxygen. That metabolic process is pretty slow, but that's okay because I'm just sitting here with a low heart rate. And so my demand for fuel is pretty low, and I have plenty of time for my body to break that fat down. But if I increase my exercise level, so if my heart rate starts to move across that spectrum, then my body's demands for fuel increase along with the increased intensity. And so my body says, hang on, this slow oxygen dependent process to turn fat into fuel isn't enough. And I need another source of fuel that's faster. And so that's when our bodies begin to shift to using carbs for fuel. And the cool thing about carbs as a fuel source is that they can be broken down with oxygen or without oxygen, which is important for that heart rate spectrum that you saw. This is not like a switch flipping. It's not like you're using fat 1 second and you're using carbs the next second. Your body's going to gradually, over a range of heart rates, make this shift from using predominantly fat to using predominantly carbs for fuel. And the point at which your body shifts from using mostly fat to mostly carbs for fuel is your aerobic threshold, which is also, and this is where the confusion sometimes comes in, that's also called your first lactate threshold or your first ventilatory threshold. There are other metabolic milestones like anaerobic threshold that happen along that heart rate spectrum, and we could talk about that in another webinar, but I mentioned them just to underscore what Mark said. We're not always talking about the same thing. It sometimes occurs that when you even get your thresholds tested, what you need to be very clear when you're looking at that data that you know what was being tested and what was being measured so that you can then plan your training schedule around that. So that was the biology lesson, right? So, okay, what does that mean for my training? As Mark said initially, endurance, mountaineering is an endurance activity. So your bodies have to perform hour after hour on successive days. And ideally, you want to remain aerobic during that time. So you want your body to be primarily using fat for fuel, because like I said, we have lots of it. And I often think about a hibernating bear when I think about using fat for fuel. So if you think about what they do, they load up on a bunch of salmon and they go to sleep for a few months, and they're using all of that fat for fuel during that time. Since we want to be in this aerobic state when we're in the mountains, we also want to build out our aerobic capacity, which means that we want our bodies to adapt. You saw a chart on the previous slide that there are things that happen in terms of muscle fibers. There are adaptations that occur in terms of the mitochondria in our cells that allow us to become more proficient aerobically. Going back to your question, Stephanie, there is no good or bad aerobic threshold. There is no right or wrong range of heart rates for an individual. Your aerobic threshold will increase very slowly over the course of months, and by a few beats per minute. It will increase as you become more fit, but it also will decrease as we age. So there's sort of two opposing things happening there. And importantly for us, those thresholds will also decrease at elevation. There are several ways to measure your aerobic threshold. I mentioned you could go to a lab and have it tested. Again, remember to confirm what you're actually measuring and what you're actually looking at when you get that report back. You could also do a heart rate drift test, or, and this is, I think, the simplest and most low-tech way, you can pay attention if you're on a run or on a bike, get warmed up, and then pay attention to the heart rate at which you start to breathe through your mouth instead of your nose. And that's a good indicator of about what your aerobic threshold will be. And then as you design your training program, you want to spend a majority of your cardio efforts right around that heart rate. So I hope that clears things up. Is there anything, Mark, that you would add or highlight?
No, I think you covered it there, and I'm glad you had that slide because it's a complex one. I would kind of reiterate two things there. One, I don't think you can say too much how different people are, and that's not good or bad. And commonly now that folks, are using heart rate monitors and maybe training in small groups or training together, you can have amongst my whole athlete roster, the low for aerobic threshold is probably 120 or 118 or something, and the high is somewhere around 160. And those two individuals are doing the same thing at relatively the same effort level for the same period of time, and it's both great for them. It's just physiology, age, training history, etc., and I think predominantly physiology. And if they both feel bad that they should have the other number somehow, then it's just is what it is for you. And then the other thing, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit, but you did mention there, is it changes when we're at altitude. And there's some ramifications if you're training at altitude, and then I think some key understandings for the performance phase when you're climbing at altitude. So we can talk about that in a future slide. But yeah, good job with the aerobic threshold. The other thing that I would add is if you have a lab test, and you mentioned this, but you have to be really careful what you're looking at. Personally, I would way rather have no data from a lab for an athlete than wrong data, because that can really lead you down the wrong path. So just be thoughtful with that.
Just a tip in that regard, I will often have athletes ask for a sample report before they commit to working with a lab, and then I will take a look at that to make sure that what they're getting is actually going to be useful to inform their training.
Yeah.
That was great advice. I just put that in the notes, folks. Ask for that sample report if you are working with the lab. Awesome. Mark and Lisa, I think I'm going to move to the next slide. Mark is going to dive into how you train using these various heart rate zones at different intensities. Mark kind of divided the information into these three different buckets: low intensity, high intensity, and then strength training.
We're going to go over, low, high, and then strength training, because I think those are kind of it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but those are the three easiest buckets to put the training architecture in. Low intensity is probably the biggest bucket because it is where you're going to spend the most time of your training duration. And I would also argue it's the most important of the three to get right. Not that we don't also want to get strength training and high intensity training right, but if I could pick one to focus on, it would be this one. So there's a couple of overriding principles here that I think are important to understand. Probably the biggest one for folks is that this kind of training in general needs to be certainly high frequency and ideally then also fairly high volume. For most individuals, they're going to want to do some of this kind of training at kind of a minimum of 4 days a week, in my opinion, to start moving the needle in a positive direction for their aerobic fitness. And even, 5 or 6 days a week in some way, shape, or form is appropriate for more intermediate to advanced athletes. But this is the kind of training that if you're only doing certainly 1 or 2 days a week and even 3 days a week, if you're not doing any of it at the moment, that will certainly have a positive effect initially. But that will result in a fairly rapid plateau of your aerobic fitness if you're not hitting a fairly high frequency. And just the simple reason for that is that your body responds to this kind of training, and the compensation time where that you're fully recovered and ready for another bout of training is actually fairly short. So that if you're doing this appropriately, you're certainly ready to go again in a 24-hour time frame or less. So this is something you can be doing, every day if you're doing it right. This is a zone 1 and zone 2 training for most folks. I do think it's a little bit important to think about these training zones as a bit of a continuum. I know we already mentioned that, but it is very useful to have definitions for zones and starting and ending points for zones so that we can have an educated discussion and communicate, ideas and training theory. But the reality is, if you train, 1 beat a minute over or under that threshold between zone 1 and zone 2, there's effectively very little difference in the physiological effect. And same thing at the top of your zone 2, your aerobic threshold. If you're supposed to be training at 135 and your heart rate's 136 for a few minutes because you're going uphill, you didn't just undo months of hard work, or there's no tragedy there. I think there's a little bit of over dramatization of that. But in general, this is zone 1 and zone 2 training. And a little bit counterintuitively, folks that are new to aerobic training and probably don't have super well developed aerobic capacities can actually do a little more in the mid to upper zone 2 and benefit from that. Whereas really advanced athletes, sometimes that's actually too hard for them because they can move, incredibly briskly at that top of zone 2, and they need to do a little more of their training lower in zone 2 or even upper zone 1 for it to be sustainable day to day. So that's a kind of an important nuance moving forward that, as you get fitter, where you want to train in these zones may change over time. As Lisa mentioned, it's primarily fat burning when you're low intensity. And of course, in the upper part of zone 2, you're getting close to that 50-50 crossover point where you're almost equal carbs and fat. A well-trained athlete who is, who's a really efficient fat burner down in zone 1 might be getting 80 or even 90% of their energy from fat metabolism. I do think it's a useful understanding, and we'll go over this in a future slide, that almost always you're using a mixed metabolism, right? It's never 100% one and 0% other, but we're talking about a predominantly fat burning metabolism here in these lower zones. One of the other things that I think is a kind of a real take-home point and something that I like to include in the discussion of intensity and whether you're getting it right and exactly where your top of zone 2 is, et cetera, is ultimately this should be recoverable day to day. If you can't mostly recover from these training bouts and aren't mostly ready for a new bout of low intensity training the next day and the next day, there's something wrong. Either you're using the wrong modality, we've made an error in where your top of zone 2 is, et cetera. But ultimately, you should be bouncing back day to day in this training. And if that's not the case, you might want to retrace your steps and how you got to those decisions, because ultimately that's, if you're not recovering, you're not improving. So thoughts on low intensity? Lisa, I know this is a whole webinar in itself, but
Yeah. I would point out or add that this can be very monotonous, especially if, we have several people who are challenged with altitude based on where they live. So you might be spending a lot of time on a treadmill or a stair mill in order to do this low intensity work. And if you can mix that up and maybe get on a bike 1 day a week or get outside, that will help prevent injury and reduce some of that continuous monotonous work for your muscles in your body.
Yeah, people don't like to hear it, but the feedback we get a lot of times is, oh, this is sort of boring. And I'm like, Cool, you're doing it right. And yeah, I do think that especially in, without getting into the weeds of specificity, if your goal is really fairly far distant, if your climbing goal is a year away or something like that, I think there's a ton of room for other modalities that aren't incredibly sport specific. If the sport specific ones that happen to be available to you are the stair mill for the 50th day in a row, and you're a really keen mountain biker, that's okay when the goal is a year away. As the time approaches, obviously the more time that you can spend in things that look like the thing you're going to do and want to do well in, the better. But absolutely, if it's not fun to a certain degree and sustainable, then all the clever programming in the world isn't going to help.
Mark, I have two questions I want to jump in with, if that's okay. And it relates to low intensity training. I'm going to read this one just as it was written because it's kind of a two question. Walking or easy bike riding, both activities in zone 1, 2, are they considered the same, or is walking better than biking for hiking training? But I know you were also just saying variety is nice too.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have you take a stab at that one real quick.
I mean, in general, obviously, walking is better for hiking training than biking. That's a given. When people want to mix it up for, like we just touched on, for reasons of variety, that's totally fine, especially in the early phases of training when the goal is far away. If people need to mix it up because we're trying to add volume, but we're approaching the limits of what the footborne volume can be absorbed and keep the individual healthy and uninjured, then the bike is a super good application for that. And I grew up cycling, so I have some background in the bike. The bike is an incredibly efficient machine, actually. I tend to lengthen out the training volumes a little bit for things like the bike versus footborne to get the same effect. It just seems that it doesn't quite have the same demand. And I think a lot of that is sort of the lack of that eccentric loading that you get from hiking, especially downhill. So, if someone were trying to substitute, an hour of walking with something, then I would stretch that out to something more like 90 minutes on the bike if I'm looking for an apples to apples response. But yeah, totally fair game. And then my last thought is, with a lot of athletes, I'll use something like the bike or even occasionally swimming when I want an aerobic stimulus day, but I also want that day to be a fairly easy day because we're trying to recover from something. So it can be if you have just a really light day or a day that also maybe includes some strength work or something like that, then some of that low impact activity like the bike can be great.
Awesome. And then I had one other question. Mark or Lisa, feel free to answer this. It's kind of a hypothetical. Let's say their zone 2 is 128 to 153 beats per minute. If they train at 128 or if they train at 153 or close to that, are they kind of accomplishing the same thing? Is there any difference to training at, like one side of your zone or the other side of your zone? That's the question.
Yeah, I think I tend to push people close to that aerobic threshold. So my recommendation would be to be closer to the 150s as opposed to the 128 range. I think that allows you to really test your aerobic system and have a lot of good adaptations within it. And that then lets you perform efficiently at that higher heart rate. So that would be my recommendations, be closer to the upper limit and your aerobic threshold.
I would echo that. The two things, one, like Lisa mentioned, train up towards the upper part of that. You don't have to have it pegged at 152 the whole time, and just see how your body responds. If that feels very manageable, you're recovering day to day, you're not having issues, then you're probably doing okay. The other thing is that looks like that might be a lab test number. That is a bigger zone 2 than the way I would define it. So that's also encompassing a good bit of zone 1 by my definition. So just to make sure we're talking apples to apples, your top of zone 1, bottom of zone 2, and that, if that top AT is right, would be like 136 or something like that. So yeah, a thing you have to recover from. It's a little bit individual. And then the last thing I think about somewhat within that, because I'm sure Lisa does too, we deal with this wiggle room within the zones or even within zone 1 and zone 2 a lot, is what are you actually doing? If you're running on pavement for 3 hours, then having it right at 152 is going to be way harder on you than if you're biking or walking on soft ground or something like that. So think about modality there too.
So folks, you're going to see 2 big graphs on here. Don't worry though, Mark and Lisa are experts at breaking this all down for us.
I wanted to include this just as a bit of a sort of demonstration graph of what we're talking about when we take someone who is probably aerobically untrained, or maybe they have very little training history, maybe they've been training in a completely different way, and then ideally get them to a place where they're have a really robust aerobic capacity. And I tried to stack these two slides so you can kind of see the differences. The top slide is someone who has done quite a bit of probably zone 1 and zone 2 training. And I think this data was taken from Nordic skiers. And you can see that at a relatively low lactate level in the left hand, or the y-axis is lactate, that well-trained athlete can sustain that low lactate level well up into the heart rates of, their 150s even to 160 before they start to sort of reach that tipping point of living on borrowed time. And you can envision somebody that can work in the 150s as a heart rate in the mountains in extremely sustainable fashion is going to have a huge advantage over the individual in the bottom slide who is only able to get their heart rate up to 110, 120 before they start to accumulate that lactate and can't remove it via the lactate shuttle. So these are two different individuals, but this could easily be one individual who trained in a low intensity manner and pushed those numbers up. Also, you can see in here that the zone 1 and 2 is mainly fat. The zone 3, it's labeled as mixed fuel. Obviously, they're all mixed fuel to an extent. And then the high intensity is mainly carbs. So a realistic but very dramatic change in the workload that an individual can sustain at those levels. So just wanted to illustrate that a little bit. And I think that's a pretty stark illustration of, where their numbers are. And then the last thing I think is useful in this slide is just that their zone 2 number has changed dramatically, right? And this would be a quite dramatic change for one individual, but we see that sometimes with people that are really poorly aerobically trained, where they're kind of redlining in that zone 2 at 120 or something initially, and they can bump that number up to 150 sometimes with a lot of dedicated training. The top of zone 2 tends to change much more dramatically than the top of zone 3 does. It will change, but not near as dramatically. Any take-home points there for you, Lisa?
I don't want to get too deep into lactate, but I will. One thing about it, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about lactic acid versus lactate. It's lactate. We now know that it's not lactic acid. Yeah. And it's not necessarily your body. Mark mentioned the lactate shuttle. So our bodies have the ability to use that lactate, which is a byproduct, for more fuel. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it gets a bad rap, but it's that point, and you see it on both of those slides to the right of the red arrow. It's where that shuttle, that metabolic process to reuse the lactate, is outpaced by the lactate that's being produced as a byproduct from our muscles. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's super helpful. We've been looking at that low intensity training, but now we're going to switch gears to the high intensity training.
Yeah, and so there's two more buckets here, and maybe we'll try and be a little more expeditious with these so it's not a 3-hour presentation. But the bread and butter, and the underpinnings of everybody's training program for mountaineering and for all endurance sports, in my mind, needs to be that low intensity work, right? And that needs to be there in the base phase, and it also needs to be there in the more specific phases later in training, no matter what. But as you've done that work and as sort of you've made those improvements, there's room and it's appropriate to start layering in other training intensities. The most obvious one is, quote, high intensity training. And this, in one slide, this is an incredibly gross oversimplification of intensity training. And, a lot of coaches would cringe this being one slide. But for the sake of brevity, I do think that intensity work is incredibly useful for mountaineers for a number of reasons. And we at Evoke and myself have probably helped paint this picture that it's the enemy somehow, but it's definitely not. In general, for most folks, it's 1 to 2 days a week will have some kind of intensity. 1 day a week works really well, considering all the other things you're trying to cram in a training week. In my mind, it's not a substitute at any point for the low intensity work. In that once you get to this phase of training and you're going to layer in some high intensity work, I think one of the big errors is to really back off of the volume of low intensity work. And you have to make room for it in your calendar, and you have to make room for it physiologically to recover from. But you can't chop half of the low intensity work out of the program just to layer this in, because that will greatly erode your aerobic capacity, which is the very thing we're trying not to do. So I think that's an important concept. With regard to heart rate zones, and I think heart rate zones become less and less useful as you do higher and higher intensities. But certainly in zone 3 and sometimes in zone 4, I do like to talk about them. And in general, most intensity work that folks would be doing will be in zone 3 or zone 4, or somewhere actually in that zone 3, zone 4 borderline. I do think it's useful to look at heart rate. A lot of these intensity applications are going to be in the form of interval training. So I really like to use heart rate zones, and heart rate in particular, to look at a series of intervals and make sure they're being done in a somewhat sustainable way. If you see your heart rate fall off after some number of intervals and decay greatly, probably means you've overcooked the first couple of intervals and you want to adjust your intensities, but I do think it's useful that way. Very generically, when you're starting to layer this in, 5 to 10% of your total training volume can be higher intensity work. I would probably err towards the 5% to start, but if for easy math, I like to think about an athlete doing 10 hours of work a week. Folks might not be doing quite that much, but if you're doing 10 hours a week and you're going to do 10% of that intensity, obviously that's an entire hour of intensity work, which is actually quite a lot for an athlete. So a lot of times 5% is a little better target there. And then especially in the mid to late phases of training, I really like the intensity work to be something that is relatively sport specific. If you can, having that be footborne, having it be involve carrying some weight, if that's the thing you're training for, just all those applications, because there is sort of some downstream effects where I think the higher intensity work makes you move in a more economical fashion. And especially if you can train in a way that's a very good analogy for the thing that you're going to do in the field and your training goals, then the economy is going to be all the more enhanced. Sometimes there's good reasons to use different modalities and do intensity work on the bike. Somebody's is skirting an injury or something like that. But when you can do it in a very real world way, I think that's helpful. And for mountaineers, that's going to need to involve quite a bit of resistance to get your heart rate at these upper intensities. So you're going to need to probably incorporate some significant incline and or some pack weight with this. So that can be outdoors. Stair mill is a good application for folks, or a really steep incline trainer is a good application. This is a kind of a high level light touch, but Lisa, thoughts on intensity work?
Just to highlight a couple of things, the two big takeaways for me are that it's not a substitute for low intensity work. So often I think we are conditioned to believe that if it's not intense, it doesn't count. And as endurance athletes, that's not true for us. And so if your comfort zone is high intensity, it might be painful at first to focus on the low intensity work, but it's worth it to take the time to do that. So that's the big takeaway for me.
Yeah. I have one other thought there, which was actually that bullet point I didn't fill in. One thing that we encounter in the mountains, and this is a rabbit hole, I won't go too far down, but when you go to altitude, as the intensity of your workload increases, you see a modest increase in heart rate, but you see a marked increase in your respiratory rate, right? When you're working fairly hard at altitude, I don't care who you are, you're going to be breathing quite hard, especially in comparison to what you would be doing at home at sea level. And one of the things I like about intensity work at home is it makes you breathe hard, right? And if you only train in zone 1 and zone 2 and you do it properly, your respiratory rate really doesn't ever get that high. Like Lisa mentioned, it's kind of on the margin of being able to nose breathe most of the time, even at its higher intensities. And inevitably, when you go to altitude, you are going to be breathing really hard. And one of the things I really like to avoid with athletes is any new stressors physiologically when they go to do their goals. And, I think it would be somewhat foolish to go to these big climbs where you're going to be breathing hard and just literally have never been breathing hard in training. Just from a kind of respiratory demand and just all that, skeletal muscular system, your diaphragm, your intercostal muscles that are just working so hard to make you breathe at those intensities. It's just good to get them out and train them a little bit. So I think that's one of the additional things high intensity training does that people don't think of necessarily.
Awesome. Mark, I'm going to go ahead and move you forward and talk about strength training.
Of the buckets, this is, in my mind, the one that has the most variability between athletes, and for a couple of reasons. One, where individual athletes are just with their training history varies wildly for me on this one. You know, some people, they're lifelong gym users and are quite strong. If we're thinking only about what we need to do to improve their abilities for the goal climbs, they probably have very little work to do in this realm. Other folks, might be on the other spectrum. Maybe, you have folks that have never strength trained or never set foot in a gym. And if their goals demand it, they would want to spend quite a bit of time strength training. So with regards to the goal, I think it's really important for an individual athlete to take a kind of critical look at where they are now and where they need to be for that goal. And the other thing, just the nature of our sport, is something that's low to moderate altitude, that is unladen and doesn't have a high degree of technicality, in and of itself probably doesn't have a huge strength demand. And, all the strength training in the world isn't going to make you dramatically more well prepared for that. The other end of the spectrum, and I always like to use Denali as an example here, some of these goals are multi-day, and just the nature of the climbs are such that you have a lot of equipment with you. It's very heavy, and just physically moving that stuff around is really demanding, especially for athletes that don't have a strength history, or maybe athletes that are, a little smaller framed and just have less body mass, because it's the amount of equipment that you have to carry doesn't vary wildly between individuals, but, people's strength varies wildly. So think critically about, what your goal is and how to be ready for that. But outside of being sort of quote unquote more ready for your goal, I think there's a really powerful argument for strength training just for general health and longevity for athletes. That is probably more of a driver for me for prescribing strength than actually making people better for any short-term goal. It's fairly well documented that actually the injury rate for strength training is pretty low, but the injury prevention potential is quite high. And I also think that for just aging athletes, which a lot of my athlete roster I would put in there along with myself, just the retention of muscle mass and hopefully the retention of bone density as you age is really important here. So yeah, we could do a whole nother webinar about this, but I do think, generally 2 days a week. I think, 2 days a week is a pretty good generic prescription for folks for strength, and getting in the gym and actually doing movements with loads that are going to make you stronger, and not being afraid to load up some of these movements and make sure that you're really getting some good work done in the gym. Lisa, I know you deal with strength training a lot. Thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll add a couple things. One is to make sure that that strength that you're building is functional. So Mark touched on this. Really be aware of what the strength demands are for whatever your goal is. And those are vastly different if you're climbing Kilimanjaro versus climbing Denali. We have a tendency, some of us, to want to, build a lot of strength, and every ounce of muscle that's on our frame has to not only be carried up the mountain, but also oxygenated. So you want to make sure that everything you're building is going to be beneficial for your climb. And then I'll touch just briefly on strength training for women, because I think it becomes very important. It's important for all of us, but for women especially, I just have this personal desire to make sure that we're incorporating strength training into what we do, because it makes us resilient. And there's some things that we can do in terms of both fueling and organizing your training around our menstrual cycles. So that's an important way, I think, to take your training to the next level, to really be sure that the load you're putting on your body is in sync with your body and where it's at that moment in time. Especially for women, as we age, we know that strength training stimulates bone growth and that it helps prevent bone loss. And as Mark said, it makes us much more resilient and injury proof in terms of our joints and ligaments, and it makes them stronger because we have that structural support then. So don't skimp out on it. I see many athletes who we all love being outside. I'm one of those people too. I would rather be on a trail or in the mountains than in the gym. But I will promise you that committing those 1 or 2 days a week to very specific strength training will up your game when you're outside. So don't omit it or leave it out of your training program.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you for including that. When you're doing strength training, because it's fairly low intensity, I'm guessing your heart rate's not going high. Does that count at all towards like the volume of developing that low intensity training at all? Or should you really look at these as separate things? So question was, does time spent doing strength training count towards training volume for developing cardio?
I look at them as separate things. I don't know, Mark, what you would say, but when I'm programming for someone, I'm sort of thinking about the cardio that they're doing in a given week and the strength building that they're doing in a given week. There may be some adaptations in terms of cardio benefit when you're doing strength training, but I don't think it's significant enough to subtract that from the volume of cardio they're going to do in a week.
Yeah, 100%. If I have to answer that question, my one-word answer is no. My slightly more complex answer, which I'll keep short, is I approach strength training to be just that. You shouldn't be trying to get a cardio component out of it. Like if your heart rate is quite high in a sustained fashion for your entire strength routine, unless you're purposely doing a metabolically demanding strength routine late in the training, which I am not a fan of, but I understand why people do it. Your heart rate actually shouldn't be crazy high on average for an hour of strength training. And then secondarily, and this is the one that gets really in the weeds, but when you strength train, and even if you do it in a way that gets your heart rate up, like you do a bunch of squats and then you run over to the bench press and you do a bunch of bench and and you're running back and forth, your heart rate can be reasonably high. Right? You can certainly get your heart rate in zone 1. You can even get it in zone 2. The reasons it is in those zones metabolically is different than the reasons it's in those zones when you're walking on the treadmill. What we're actually trying to do is to create a metabolic demand when we train in zone 1 and zone 2. We don't actually care what your heart rate is. That's just the thing that we can measure to get at the thing we care about. I think this is largely misunderstood and argued about, but yeah, doing a million, weighted squats in the gym or whatever it is metabolically different and functionally different than walking, uphill outside. And so, no, it doesn't count towards aerobic training, and sort of nor should it, is my long-winded short answer.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. We're just measuring the heart rate, and that's our indicator. We're going to switch gears, and Lisa is going to talk about recovery, tapering, and then mental preparation. And then we're going to jump into, hey, I live in Florida, or I'm this old, I have this going on. So we'll jump into those common questions. So Lisa's going to jump in now and, of course, talk about recovery, and then also how we incorporate tapering into the end of our training as we get ready for an expedition. So Lisa, jump right in.
Yeah, so the takeaway, first of all, I'm glad people are asking about recovery, because for some people it's hard to incorporate that into a training program. We want to go hard all the time. But my headline here is that recovery is a part of training. It shouldn't be left out or deprioritized as you're putting a plan together. So training is a stressor to our bodies and our nervous systems, just like stress from work or a fight with a friend. And as athletes, we're also then intentionally adding more stress to that equation because we're doing regular training. So that means it becomes especially important for us to give our bodies, and I would argue our minds, a break from that rigor of continuous training. And I think of that in terms of three ways that you can incorporate that training into your program. So there should be recovery days where you don't train at all, or you do something very, very low impact. And then I will like to schedule a recovery week for people that occurs, it's sort of at a minimum every 4 weeks. And it depends on the person and what their fatigue is, and if we're looking at their HRV and things like that. But I would plan a recovery week about once a month where you should have about 50% less load from training than normal. And then the third thing that I look at is incorporating some form of recovery into the regular activities that you're doing as a part of your training. So those three things, I think, are a way to make sure that you're incorporating it and getting enough of it. It's during these periods of less intense work or recovery time when our bodies are actually repairing and rebuilding. And the other cool thing I think about recovery weeks is that it also allows us to take a mental break from the rigor and sometimes the stress of a training plan and knowing you have to do something every day. So the recovery activities that I like are low impact, things like walking or swimming or doing an easy bike ride for 30 or 60 minutes. And those just get your blood flow moving. They promote blood flow, and that will help to accelerate your recovery. I also am a fan of a cold shower, or if your gym has a cold plunge, I think those are great ways to recover and to reduce inflammation in your body. You can, if you're doing a shower at home, start slow. It's not fun in the beginning, but work up to 3 to 5 minutes in that cold environment to help reduce some inflammation. And I'm also a fan of mobility work. So doing some kind of dynamic mobility exercises that help improve the range of motion of your joints. I think it's good for longevity, but it's also good to enhance recovery. The other thing that is sometimes overlooked as a source of recovery is sleep. And this is crucial. And I see a lot of athletes that we're busy, we're trying to work and take care of a family and train at the same time. And so they'll cut sleep short, but this is our best method of recovery. So we've probably all heard, the tips to go to sleep at the same time, wake up at the same time, don't have screens in front of you when you're trying to fall asleep. But the higher quality of sleep you can get, the more time you're going to give your body to recover. And then I want to also highlight the importance of listening to your body. So even if you have recovery time built into your plan, if you on your training calendar, it says you should run 10 miles today and you get out there and your legs feel heavy and you're just not into it, then let that go. Do your best, of course, but always let your body be a barometer of whether or not you're ready to train. And now, we're all wearing this technology on our wrists. So use that to your advantage as well. If you can measure reliably your resting heart rate or your HRV, pay attention to those physiological indicators because they can also tell us if it's time for recovery. The last thing I'll say about recovery is that I know I put myself in this bucket. It can be challenging to take a break from training because it feels like we're not doing everything that we possibly can. So if you're struggling to take a break or to dial things back on a given week, remember that it's a part of training. And if it helps, do something that still helps you prepare for your goal during your recovery time. So you could study the route or shop for gear or interview someone else who climbed the mountain that you're getting ready to climb. All of those things are still an important part of preparation, and they can help take some of that pressure that you might feel off of having to have a recovery week. So this leads us to tapering. When it comes to tapering, I know, Alan, you asked how long we should taper, and there's not really a clear-cut answer. I'll tell you what my sort of guidelines are, but each athlete responds differently to recovery and to tapering, and each mountain is different as well. So if your goal is, say, Everest or Aconcagua or something that has a long trek or there's a lot of travel time, then I calculate someone's recovery time based on when they're going to start actually climbing. And so in that case, they may have a shorter taper period while they're at home. But there are some mountains like Rainier, for example, or Denali, where you hit the ground running and you start climbing right away. And in that case, I would program a longer taper period. I think it's important to say also that everyone responds differently, and it's kind of a matter of understanding your signs of fatigue. And if you're working with a coach, communicating that with them so that you can really dial it in for what you need for whatever your objective is. Would you add anything to that, Mark?
No, but the more I coach and the more athletes that I deal with, I can't overstress the amount that sleep. I engage and love all the other things that go into recovery. But man, if somebody is not sleeping well, like all the nutrition and foam rolling in the world isn't going to help them. And it's not that I don't think those things are important. And then the other thing with that I think is a little hard for athletes to gauge is when you're really doing big training volumes, you have to sleep more. Even if you were doing a good job, what was sufficient at a previous time might not be sufficient now. And a lot of times that means taking a big fat nap sometimes if you can. And not everybody can, but that's 30 to 60 minute nap every day is just awesome for people. So yeah, sleep I just think is just so important in big volume training cycles.
Wonderful. Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and have us switch to the next slide because this one is very close to our hearts here at CTSS, and it is equally as important to your strength and your fitness and your aerobic game is your mental preparation. Lisa, again, this is one of the reasons we absolutely adore working with both you and Mark is because you also value and understand that this is part of the picture.
Yeah, such an important topic, and I'm glad you're including it because it's really an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to preparation and being, I would say, safe and prepared in the mountains. So I'm guessing if you're on this webinar, you realize that mountain pursuits require a great deal of mental strength as well as physical. And I would even argue, there's an elevation above which mental strength is more important than physical, especially when we get into the high mountains, because our bodies are just starting to deteriorate and it's really dependent upon our strength mentally in order to keep going or to push through things. From that perspective, then it's critical that we build out mental strength in addition to physical. And before we get into a few ways to do that, I think it's also important to remember that our brains are meant to keep us safe. They process something that's unknown as a threat or as something that's scary. So for example, if you're on Mount Rainier and you're walking across the Emmons Glacier and you look down for the first time into a crevasse, your brain's reaction is going to be fear. And you're going to process that fear in predictable ways, right? That we've all heard about, flight or freeze, or now I think there's a fourth fawn. And so we can work with that. We can start to train our brains to be prepared for whatever those difficult situations or those fearful circumstances are. And the cool thing about our brains is that they don't know the difference between what we think and what we actually experience, which is crazy when you think about it. But maybe you've read studies where people would actually play a piano versus thinking about playing a piano. And even the people who thought about it could actually do it. So that means that if we take the time then to mentally rehearse things that we know are going to be challenging for us on the mountain, then they're less novel and therefore less fear-inducing when they do happen in the mountain. So I'm a big fan of visualizing, of studying the route, watching YouTube videos, talking to other people who've done it, and thinking about the things that you've seen in those videos that give you pause or that worry you for some reason, and then to visualize yourself moving through those circumstances in a strong, confident way. So mentally rehearsing and visualizing is one thing that we can do. And I think reframing is also another important tool when things get tough in the mountains. So I have been there many times where I start this story in my head of how this is too hard, this backpack is too heavy, I'm going too slow. And instead of letting that story sort of percolate and grow in your brain, if you can reframe that situation in a positive way, it will help you stay in the moment and also be more confident about how you're moving. So reframing is another important tool. And then I just mentioned the last one that I would point out, which is just being present. So in the moment, it's sometimes easy, as I said, to have this story sort of convince you that you're not capable or you're not doing well. But when you actually stop to think about how you're doing and pay attention to your body's signals, it can really be a way to strengthen your mental capacity and I think allow you for better decision making as well. So staying present and separating facts from stories that we often tell ourselves is a way to be mentally prepared in the mountains. And I think it's important to include this mental prep as a part of your training plan. Every athlete is different. Some people really dive into this and will actually I'll give them visualizations and will really get into being mentally prepared. And other people just don't want to focus so much on mental preparation, but I have seen it be a game changer in the mountains many times. That's my take on that. Mark, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think the other thing for me, which kind of, is an extension of your mental, rehearsing, is literal rehearsing. And that is, for a lot of times, that has to be in sort of intermediate goal climbs. So if you have little intermediate, B, not A goals, but B goals, if they can include aspects of your A goal that you find intimidating, that can be hugely helpful for people. And, I know that's easier said than done because we can't all go climbing every weekend. But, if you can get out on a glacier, if you can do a Denali training course that's in Alaska or whatever those environmental things are, so that you can kind of break those mental challenges into pieces and sort of experience them one or two at a time and absorb them, then you're always going to be more comfortable the subsequent time. And so I think that's hugely important. And I do, this is mostly from my guiding experience, I do see a lot of people that have huge mental challenges. A lot of that is just because they haven't done anything that's remotely like that thing that they find challenging. And that is to some degree solvable, right? By getting out in front of it. So no, absolutely. This is a huge topic. And I was laughing when you said above a certain altitude that it's more mental than physical, because I think that altitude's about sea level. For sure.
Actually, I was just talking to Mike Hamill. He's the co-founder of Climbing the Seven Summits about this a little bit. We're doing a webinar on Mount Baker and a kind of essential mountaineering skills. And he was really saying, like imagine showing up, like even like, I think this picture's from Lobichet with Tindy here. Imagine showing up here and you haven't strapped on your crampons or you haven't gotten in your gear in 2 years or something like that. And so these courses where you can kind of go and practice those skills again, even if you're a seasoned climber, is just not only going to keep you technically sharp, but it's going to keep your head in the game once you're there and you're on the mountain with the team. So I think that's really important. It was really reiterated by him in our conversation we were having, which is neat.
The only other thing I would add to that conversation is for people that have moderate to fairly significant amounts of mental stress during an expedition that is by and large unnecessary, it is a huge physical drain. Like those people are always going to be so far behind the curve because they're spending so much emotional energy worrying about all the things. And that's where getting out in front of that, having experienced some of those things first, and then really being in the moment. Because when you're on a 6-week expedition, there are so many things you could be worrying about it if that's where your brain goes. But if you just stay right now, what's the best I can be doing, problem solving right now, and not worrying about how Dave on the other end of your rope is going to do 4 weeks from now, or what kind, if you have the right long underwear for summit, like there's so much shinola you can worry about if you want to. Just staying in the moment is really calming for a lot of people and just doesn't waste energy you don't have to waste in those situations.
That makes sense. I think I'd like to start about altitude. People are asking about the best ways to train if you're coming from low elevation, strategies to prepare for high altitudes. Should I do breathing exercises to get ready? I'm coming from the Midwest. What should I do? So we're going to talk about that Flatlander. That's what we have it called right there. Flatlander training first. And I did just send along the acclimatization webinar, which is an amazing resource. So Mark and Lisa, do one of you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how you work with people that are coming from the Midwest, East Coast, close to the oceans, West Coast, that are having a harder time accessing mountains?
So in terms of training, you're probably going to spend most of your time on a treadmill or a stair mill or in stadium stairs or on a building. But then the opportunity to acclimatize before you show up for your climb, if you live in the flats, is pretty hard to do. I think there are things you can do in terms of taking care of yourself and eating well and staying hydrated. But what you really are trying to do is stimulate the production of a hormone called EPO, which then causes your body to build more red blood cells. There are some breathing techniques which I have studied but not tried myself. So I read studies which say that those breathing techniques will stimulate EPO, but I don't have actual field experience to say whether that's going to be enough for you to be, partially acclimatized before you get to the trailhead. There are higher tech things you can do. So there are companies who make hypoxic generators that you can sleep in and train in. Those are probably the most, I would say, the gold standard today if you want to start that acclimatization process early. And I have used those and I'm a fan of them. I have many athletes that use them. I've tested my own red blood cell count and seen that it increases by working out or sleeping in a hypoxic environment. My asterisk around that is that you have to be very careful about recovery, about what we just talked about, what Mark said, the big importance of getting enough sleep. If you're sleeping in a hypoxic environment, you're probably not sleeping well, which could impact your ability to train. That's detrimental then to the training and to the goal that you're trying to achieve. So be very careful about how you're recovering if you're training hypoxically. And I have many athletes, and I know this isn't possible for all of us, but athletes before they go to Everest, for example, may travel to a place in the US like Colorado and spend a month or so there, just getting out in the mountains and hiking and training and living. Those red blood cells that you build when you're at elevation will last about 120 days. So you will carry some of them with you when you start your climb. So there are low tech ways. I don't have personal experience to know whether they work. And then some higher tech ways like using a hypoxic generator in order to build those red blood cells before you go.
Can I add in one thing? I think it's nice to point out, especially when you're thinking about like a big expedition like Aconcagua or Everest, when you're acclimatizing and you're thinking about how to get ready for this. And this came up in our last webinar on Aconcagua. And Mike Hamill, again, specifically was mentioning that in a lot of the expedition itineraries, all the itineraries for CTSS, unless you're doing a speed ascent, acclimatization is built into the schedule. This is why you see us having longer time on the mountain for Kilimanjaro or Aconcagua, things like that. Our itineraries are built to include all the acclimatization, even if you are coming from Indiana, Illinois, something like that. And so it is really important not only to work with anyone you're training with, but also just to talk to your expedition company and say, hey, is this something I should be doing or not doing? Because Mike said, it could actually be detrimental if you use hypoxico when you have the amount of time to acclimatize. If you're doing a speed ascent, totally different. If you're doing something outside of those bounds, totally different. But it's really, really just a good point to check in and see what is the acclimatization schedule like, and should I be doing any of this? Not only asking your trainers, but also asking the expedition company what they think. And then if you are interested in speed ascents and using Hypoxico, which is an incredible company, that acclimatization webinar actually has Chad from Hypoxico in it, speaking about it and talking about it. And it's a really great resource to pull in on and to see if that's something you're interested in. So I wanted to add in that little caveat, just to remember to always touch base with the folks you're climbing with to see what's happened. Mark, anything else to add on acclimatization?
Yeah, just a couple of short things. I always think that individuals should regard showing up to a climb fit as they can and uninjured and healthy as their primary defense against altitude problems. All the pre-acclimatization in the world for an incredibly unfit person isn't going to help. The other thing I think I would add is, especially in these conversations with like using the hypoxico tent, but also just what I would think of as a normally paced trip, like you're referring to as, a CTSS trip on Aconcagua, as an example. I think it's important to understand how your body works as an individual, because this is something that's not really a blanket. The concepts are blanket, but how you respond to altitude with any given time frame is largely genetic. And, some people are just better responders than others. It's been my experience that most everyone can climb most of these high altitude peaks given enough time to acclimate, but not everybody acclimates at the same rate. So this is again where breadth of experience as a climber, getting some intermediate goals in, doing an Ecuador trip before you go to Aconcagua or something like that, and really trying to build a bit of a base of knowledge just about how your body works is really important, because it's not quite one size fits all. And then that also extends to as I'm sure Lisa has too, deal with a lot of hypoxico tent users. I have some athletes that they kind of do okay in the tent, and it's obvious it's a net plus for sure then. And I have other athletes for various reasons, they basically almost cannot sleep in the tent. And if you just take it out of context of the altitude, if you did anything that prevented you from sleeping for 4 weeks before the biggest athletic goal of your life, I don't think it takes a fitness expert to understand what the ramifications would be of that. So yeah, just some work ahead of time, going on these little trips, seeing how your body works, and then maybe using the tent to prepare for one of these intermediate goals, so you have a little bit of background on that before it's the biggest, most time-consuming, most expensive thing you've ever done. And you're like, well, I hope the hypoxico works. I've never tried it before. I just find that to be a little bit unwise and kind of a miss when you could probably get out in front of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're going to switch away from training at flatlands and kind of preparing for acclimatization. I want to switch gears to talking about age and also talking about gender. Folks, I want to give you a little rundown. So we've been asked questions like, I'm over 45. How does age 60 plus, over 50 training, considerations for a 60-year-old? I'm 68. How does this work for me? Those are all a variety of questions you all have asked about age and how this impacts training and just the expedition itself and getting ready. I know we've talked a little bit about the importance of also strength training as you get older, but I wanted to open up the floor to Mark and Lisa to speak about training as you start to age and mature in life. And if there's anything else you wanted to add in or any other tidbits. I know one person specifically flagged the knees as a concern. which I think is something that many of us feel even at a young age. And as we get older, our joints and bones start to get a little stiffer.
I can start on that one. And it's interesting because we're dealing with acclimatization discussions for low altitude athletes and aging here. And I would say 80% more, maybe close to 90% of my coached athletes are over 50 and don't live at altitude. These questions are everyone, basically. For aging athletes, the first thing that I think of is as you age, you don't recover as well. That's just part of the deal. You don't recover as quickly. And if something really catastrophic happens, you don't recover as completely. What that means for training architecture is you just probably need a little longer runway to get from your fitness now to the perceived fitness you need to be for the goal. So starting ahead of time as far as you can use a nice slow ramp rate and stay healthy and just build in extra time for recovery along the way. I think that's probably the paramount thing. The secondary thing is you may end up not being able to, even if you train really well, you just might not be as fast. Making sure that you do all the other things, and specifically acclimatization is especially important. And I think for aging folks, I already, harped on sleep, but I think nutrition becomes increasingly important for an aging athlete, making sure you're getting enough protein so that you can just support your system as best you can in all those ways. And then the last thing I find, it's everybody, and Lisa touched on it in the beginning of the talk about consistency. That's just many-fold more important for an aging athlete. If you let yourself get out of shape, for lack of a better way of describing it, for the goal, it's so much harder to get it back. Whereas somebody in their 20s and 30s, they can ebb and flow in that roller coaster. They can get it 90 or 95% back in a relatively reasonable time frame. But especially if you're in your 60s, and I have some athletes in their 70s, you just don't have that luxury. So you really, really have to be on it all the time with consistency, for sure. Lisa, I'm sure you've dealt with some people over 50 in training.
Yeah, I've, coached people who are 15 and people who are in their 80s. Everything you said is absolutely valid, Mark. And I think more about the athlete and how they're adapting than, oh, you're this age and therefore it means this. I've worked with people who are in their 30s and just don't adapt quickly to training. And I've worked with people who are far older and, just like that, they see adaptations and positive changes. So I guess I encourage whoever's asking or wondering about this to not necessarily put yourself in a certain bucket because you're a certain age, but to set the goal and work hard and do all the right things to get ready and let your body be the barometer of what you're capable of.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for that. Lisa, anything else you want to add in, since we were talking about age specifically right there? Anything else, or Mark, on men, women, or anything in between? Any special considerations, especially as the aging female or the aging male? Anything that you would love to share or that you share with athletes if they're concerned about that?
Yeah, I'll talk again just about women athletes and being aware of what your menstrual cycle is. And if you can organize your training around that, it's beneficial to get the most out of the time you put into training. And then Mark touched on something earlier that I see as a deficiency in a lot of people, particularly women, and that is just the need to eat more protein. So if someone's like not getting the most out of the training or they're not building muscle as quickly as they believe they should, we'll start to look at their nutrition and look at their macros, and very often they are low in protein. So getting more of that into your diet, and if it's hard to do, there's great protein powders that you can make a yummy shake as a snack in the afternoon. So any way that you can get more protein is important. And then just to go back to strength training, it's especially important for women as we age to get that stimulus from really lifting heavy weights. There's been studies that said that we need that kind of impact on our muscles in order to stimulate growth and keep them strong. And it's not like running alone isn't enough of that. We need to be doing more jumping. We need to be lifting heavier weights. So those are things that I would consider if you are a woman and you're getting ready to climb some big mountains.
Awesome. One question I wanted to ask on nutrition, since we're kind of bridging the gap there a little bit. Earlier, you were saying we primarily burn fats when we're doing the low intensity training, and we primarily burn carbs when we're doing high intensity training. Again, it's not 100% always. So could it be beneficial if you consumed more fat to have more fat to burn? Does that help, or are we already holding enough fat to burn?
Yeah. We have plenty.
Yeah, 100,000 calories.
We have plenty. The things that you need are, so we have enough to sustain that zone 2 activity. We have enough fat to sustain that activity. But if you want, my go-tos are usually heavy carb snacks when I'm in the mountains. I'll like to include a little bit of protein in that because it helps the recovery. But you don't need to be adding more fat to what you're eating in the mountains. Focus on things that have a lot of carbs because that's going to give you quick energy. And if you're at elevation, our body's ability to digest those macros changes and digestion becomes more difficult. So carbs are much easier to digest than fats and proteins.
Yeah, I'd really echo that last point of Lisa's in that your gut is not going to want to deal with fat at altitude from a fuel source perspective. One of my big things in training for folks, like I mentioned with some of the earlier things, is we want to eliminate all the unknowns. And especially with fueling, I'm not only thinking about in terms of like what's useful at the moment in training, but what is going to set you up for success because it will have familiarity when you go on your goal climbs. And I think especially like for the long training day, I encourage folks to fuel in the way that will be realistic for their goal climb so that their body is used to it. And both, in amount, in duration of feeding, and in specific nutritional products they might be using. So I'm not a huge fan of fat intake during training anyway, but even if I was, that's kind of unrealistic at altitude. Your gut is just battling at altitude to digest food. So use things that are realistic for your goal climbs.
No, that's great advice. I totally am a fan of testing things out before the final exam.
So Lisa and Mark, questions about if you should run any blood tests or get to know what's happening in your body before a trip, concerns about carbs and blood sugar issues, and then any suggestions for what to eat.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say that some people maybe don't think about specifically with protracted like high altitude expeditions that I think is a miss for some folks is their iron. Iron is a tricky one, and if your iron levels aren't right, then you're going to have trouble producing extra hemoglobin in the field because you won't be setting yourself up for success there. And if it's wrong, it also takes a little bit to dial it in sometimes. So that's something that I think is useful from a blood panel perspective. But I would be doing that, as far out as you can, 6 months ahead of time or 12 months ahead of time, so that if you're finding something in error there, you have time to reel it in. And I've actually watched and worked with Rebecca a lot from that nutritional perspective. I think she has a really good common sense take on fueling. The one thing that I would add that I've just had some feedback from athletes is there's this sort of idea of what is ideal for an amount of fueling and should honestly be a target for folks like on a summit day, how much you can eat and when. The majority of folks, just because of the nature of the environment and the strains of altitude, can't actually eat that much. And that's okay. Don't create an additional stress by sort of freaking out that you're eating half of what Rebecca or another nutritionist recommended. It's good to have goals in life, and it's good to have goals for what you're going to eat on a summit day. But if you're coming up short on those, it's going to be okay. You're fit enough, and if you're well trained, you're going to be able to survive that. And I've had many summit days, where I was trying to eat 100 calories an hour, and I got in 200 calories total, and it's just part and parcel of the harsh mountain environment.
Yeah, I think what's important, I don't think there's any harm in doing a full blood panel before you go, but I would start that process 6 to 9 months so that you have time to correct anything that's low or any deficiencies that you see. And I think working with I really am a fan of functional medicine doctors who want to get to the root cause of those things and offer practical solutions. I think that's very beneficial too.
And then one last general question that I want to have you guys speak about. I know even when we started conversating about this, we were talking about that general formula that's often used to find your various zones, which is 220 minus your age equals your max. Do you all use that formula to help find people's heart rate zones? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think Mark and I are aligned with this, that we don't use it. It's convenient, if you are in a pinch, I guess, and want to get a guideline. But that study, I think, was done on college athletes, male college athletes. It's not representative of a full population of people. And I think if you do that simple math, you're going to probably be wildly off on your heart rate zones. It's much better to, if you can work with a lab to get your actual personal zones tested. And just as a rule of thumb, pay attention, like I said earlier, to when you have to start breathing through your mouth instead of your nose, which is a pretty good indicator of what your aerobic threshold is.
That question in particular was asking about max heart rate of 220 minus your age as opposed to the math formula of 180 minus your age for zone 2. Yeah, both are good ways to come up with a wildly inaccurate number if you want. I don't want to say I don't care, but I sort of don't care what an athlete's max heart rate is because we're basically not working up towards that number ever anyway. And there's not a lot you can do about it, honestly, is that your max heart rate does come down as you age. And there's not a wealth of evidence that shows that being fit or any kind of zone 2 or intensity training prevents that largely. There's some ideas that delta between your top of zone 2 and your max gets smaller as you age, and there's a little bit of evidence that maybe you don't want to do all your training right at the top of your zone 2 because that heart rate reserve number is smaller. But the reality of a day-to-day low intensity training, your max heart rate doesn't really matter. Yeah.
All right. So folks, we're going to switch gears over to kind of the last set of questions. When you sign up for a climb with CTSS, we send you, of course, a whole suite of information. In that suite of information, of course, is information about your climb, where to be, what the itinerary is. We do include a trip-specific training plan designed by Lisa. We include an overarching fitness training for mountaineering designed by Mark. We also include a nutrition for fitness or for mountaineers designed by Rebecca. So all three of those resources from these people we've kind of just been talking about. Of course, Mark and Lisa are here, but we've been talking a lot about nutrition. All three of those resources are included for you. And so we really do give you the tools to understand nutrition and fitness generally as it relates to mountaineering, and then how it relates specifically to your trips. Because every training plan is going to look a little different, whether you're doing Baker or Ecuador or Denali, of course. But we've kind of categorized them as beginner, intermediate, and advanced climbs. There's always correlations between them. But I wanted you all to start thinking about your training plans and the resources that we offer folks as they're preparing for these climbs. So this is a very general slide. I know it's pretty incredible hard to speak about beginner climbs as a holistic kind of chunk, but I'm going to let Mark and Lisa just talk generally about training plans they do use, the resources they do share, and how they might approach various climbs.
Yeah, so I would say the principles for all of these, sort of the periods of training and many of the high-level principles are the same, regardless of whether you're climbing Baker or you're climbing Everest. I like to think about training in a couple of different chunks, and we've touched on all of those. So making sure first that an athlete has a really solid base of general training, general fitness. So that's just general strength training, and that could vary depending on how experienced that athlete is and how they've trained in the past. And during that first phase, we'll also start to build out your cardiovascular capacity with lots of zone 2 training that Mark was talking about. And then we'll advance from there to the strength specific things that were on one of those initial slides, and making sure that that strength training is specific for you and for your climb. So that's going to look a lot different if you're carrying a 40-pound backpack on Rainier, or if you're pulling a sled on Vincent, or if you're going to Everest and you're carrying 20 pounds on your pack. So it will vary depending on the mountain. And then the last phase is to really focus on endurance. And that looks like long days of hopefully doing the type of activity that you will on the mountain. So lots of hiking or climbing in order to really build out the endurance in the specific muscle groups that you'll need for your climb. That's my high level, so hopefully beneficial, but general overview of how I think about training.
Yeah, and with these sort of buckets of, beginner, intermediate, advanced too, one of the things that strikes me in general as people move up the food chain here is that the more advanced climbs are longer in duration, like obviously in Everest for sure, but even a Denali sometimes in Aconcagua. They're very much multi-week at a minimum endeavors. And I always place an emphasis on preparing my athletes in a way that I feel like they're going to be as durable as possible over those weeks, instead of, being able to perform at their maximum for a couple of days, which, obviously a Baker, Rainier, a Mount Blanc certainly, and slightly lesser degree a Kili trip are pretty short trips. I mean, they're day trips for some people, and that's a much different demand. So that I really like to have a nice, long, clean run up to those more advanced climbs to make sure that people are healthy and have gotten a lot of really solid, uninterrupted training. And then also maybe having some of the goal climbs kind of reflect that the intermediate training climbs, so that they can get some good multi-day demand along that pathway. And we sell pre-written training plans at Evoke. We have several different ones that, certainly some are very specific for this kind of thing, for certain peaks. Like I have a Denali specific plan, but I very much encourage people to think about, where they are at the moment and where they need to be for the goal, and try and connect those dots. And I really try and frame it in that way for all my athletes, and not think in terms of whether a goal is realistic or unrealistic for a certain athlete at a certain point in their life, but how much work do you have to do to get to where you need to be for that? It's not that the goal might be unrealistic, it's that goal might be unrealistic 3 months from now, right? But 3 years from now, that's a different discussion. And so even though we sell them and I help write them, these pre-written training plans, you also have to put a little bit of thought into them, because even the best written training plan is kind of written for a theoretical person in the middle of the bell curve. And if you're not that person, it's not going to be useful. So trying to be critical, self-thoughtful, and bring in additional resources. I know that both Lisa and I are happy to get on the phone with an athlete and talk about, how they might manage that, or how coaching might help them, because it might not be a perfect one size fits all for them.
So on that note, I think it's great just to flip to the slide with your contact information. Don't hesitate to send either of them an email. They are a wealth of knowledge and resources. And again, like Mark was just saying, working with a trainer will help you take that general plan, even if it's designed for Baker or Aconcagua, and tweak it to match you, your physiology, and where you're already at with your fitness level.
No, just don't be shy. I'm happy to answer any questions or hop on a Zoom call. I think it's important, and that's why webinars like this are important, because we're all sharing this information, and hopefully as a community, it makes us all smarter and safer when we're in the mountains. So I'm happy to help.
And then folks, I also wanted to share how to contact us. Of course, we've been sharing how to contact Mark and Lisa, but I want to make sure that you can be in touch with Climbing the 7 Summits. Here's our Instagram, Facebook, website, and our email address. And then I'm also going to share a Calendly link if you would like to touch base with our team and talk more about your progression, your climbing, things like that. You can set up a call with Caroline or Mike, depending on what you're climbing. One of them will work with you. They're the 2 co-founders. So there's that Calendly link right there. And before I close out, I do just want to tell you guys just a little bit more about what sets CTSS apart from the rest. So here's just a quick slide on our philosophy. Of course, we've been talking about us being a holistic guiding company. And we know that mountaineering at this point is your fitness level, your technical skills, but also your mental strength, humility, things like that. But one of the things that also we really, really are proud of at CTSS is that we are not only 7 Summit specialists, but we're also progression specialists. If your goal is to get to Aconcagua or Denali or Everest or anything in between, we will work with you to devise a plan that works for your timeline, your budget, put you in touch with the best coaches, the best nutrition people. Oh, you need help with this. You want to look at this book now. We are really there, and we're offering one-on-one support. We're not just an email away, we're a phone call away, we're a meeting away, where you can really have your whole program custom designed for you and can work directly with our team. So we really try to be specialists in progression in the 7 Summits, but also specialists in the human side, that you deserve individual attention and that we want you to feel and know that we're working directly with you. And if you're not familiar with CTSS, we hope you come and climb with us sometime and can experience this full philosophy. You can find out more about things like our marginal gains philosophy, our no dickheads policy, which was fun, on our website. But those are really cornerstones of what set us apart, along with the other things. Mark and Lisa, I wanted to pass it back to you just to give any final thoughts as we wrap up today. I think we've answered all the questions. Woohoo! Thank you, Alan. Lots of people saying great webinar, so that goes directly to you too. Appreciate it. Mark and Lisa, any final thoughts for the folks that are here today?
I think my final thoughts with regarding training for climbing is it is really worth the time and effort you put in a lot of levels, not only to be more successful, but a fitter athlete will always enjoy the endeavor more. And to me, at the end of the day, that is really what it's about. So it's not always easy to carve out the time and energy in your life for these things, but it really pays dividends downstream while you're on these big goals. And I just shout out to Lisa for being a great co-host today.
This was fun. We should do this more often, Mark. I feel like we could tag team a lot of fun questions, but I'll echo that as well. And I'll say that, sometimes it's hard to find the motivation, especially when we're busy and there's a lot of other things going on, but you've already committed to this mountain goal. And I will often tell myself that it can either be hard now or it can be hard on the mountain. And I'd rather have it be hard now where I'm at home in my gym and I can sleep and eat well. And that will absolutely pay off to how you perform and the amount of enjoyment you have in the mountains. So cheers to many more adventures.
Woohoo! Awesome. Mark and Lisa, on behalf of CTSS, thank you so much for taking the time to be here to represent Evoke Endurance and Alpine Athletics. Your knowledge is beyond, and thank you for taking the time to share that with all of us. Folks, I think that's it. Wherever you are, I hope you enjoy your mornings or probably afternoons at this point, but thank you all, and we hope to see you on the mountain soon.